All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ryan. I'm the manager here at the Mysterious Bookshop, and we are thrilled to be hosting Paul Vidich this evening, who is going to be talking about his new spy novel. Right here, I have a signed copy right here, The Matchmaker. I believe this is your fifth novel and your third that has been selected for the Mysterious Bookshop's Thriller and Espionage Club. So you're becoming a regular perennial favorite around here in that club. It's a fantastic book. We also have Fred Wistow with us tonight, who will be speaking with Paul and asking him some questions about this incredible book. So please, for all of you that are watching and joining, please feel free to leave any comments or questions below. Hopefully, Paul will have a chance to get to them. If not, you're going to have a wonderful conversation about this book regardless. So without further ado, Paul, thank you so much for joining us. Fred, thank you for being here as well. And I'm going to hand it over to these guys. Have a great conversation. I'm excited to follow along. Enjoy.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah.
It's always great to be part of the Mysterious Bookshop.
Oh,
my favorite shop.
Thank you. No, every time we select one of your books for that club, we get lots of excited emails and notices. So thank you for keeping people excited about the bookshop and books. So enjoy, gentlemen. Have a good conversation, and I'll be back in a little bit.
Thank you. Paul, good evening. Hello. We're a few minutes late, and I'm sorry we had to start late, so I'm going to cut down on my introduction, which was basically, in essence, I met you over 30 years ago when you were, and still are, a sort of humble executive, later in the music business and whatever. And somehow in the last 5 years, you've produced 5 novels with another one on its way, you recently told me. And this new one is set, unlike the others, which took place in the 50s in Cuba, Moscow, Washington, in the 70s. And you're now in the 80s in Berlin, where the wall is about to fall. There's East German intelligence, West German intelligence, CIA, Soviet troops, a hint of the JFK assassination. You've got a woman with a missing husband. You got the Cold War. You got a lot of stuff. So how did this thing come to be? And how did you do the research to do this?
Well, thank you. But just before we start, it's been 30 great years, a great friendship, and and I'm delighted that you were able to make the time to ask these questions. When you finish one novel, which is the last one was The Mercenary, you sort of come up for air and ask yourself, so what are you going to do next? Where does an idea come from? Because it's not like I have a shelf of ideas or an index card cabinet full of ideas. And I sort of start with place, and in this case, Berlin, and I sort of had the idea that Berlin would be a good place to set a novel. But then it's always a question of which Berlin, because Berlin, unlike many cities, has been a place where spy novelists have chose to set their stories. And those stories span probably a 50-year period from Kristallnacht in 1938 until 1989. And it's 50 years of basically spying. And for different reasons. During the, obviously, Nazi regime, it was the Allies spying against Nazis. And then after the end of the war, during the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union and NATO. So it's a rich landscape. And in fact, Nikita Khrushchev, in one of his lighter moments, called Berlin a swampland of spies. And in some ways it is. So I had this choice of figuring out which Berlin I would choose, and I was drawn to the Berlin of 1989, largely because it was the end of the Cold War. And the Cold War, for me, and I'm sure for you and for people who are listening, was a dramatic event in our lives, probably a defining event in our lives. From the time as children, we were asked to get under our desks and hide from the bomb, thinking that the desk would in some way protect us.
I had a lead desk.
Right, a lead desk. And throughout that period of time, the Soviet Union was this terrible authoritarian and dangerous state, and then it disappeared. And quite remarkably, it and it all started with the fall of the wall, which happened without any gunshots, without any loss of life, and then 2 years later, the Soviet Union crumbled. So to me, that became a powerful moment to explore a story. And it so happened that the story I came upon was in an autobiography of a guy named Marcus Wolf, who was the Stasi head of counterintelligence, a very smart guy, very intelligent, very clever, somebody admired by his counterparts in the CIA and MI6. And in reading his autobiography, he describes one of his accomplishments, if you can call it that, and that was the creation of the Romeo Network, which was a group of young East German men who were sent to the West Berlin, West Germany, to meet young women who might become covers for their life as spies. And they chose vulnerable women, lonely women with drinking problems or money problems. And then they basically seduced them and sometimes married them. And that life was revealed after the wall fell, then the GDR fell. And these women woke up, understanding, now discovering that their marriages had been lies. And I thought, well, that's a really powerful premise for a novel. We all lie in our marriages in some little ways, and sometimes it's bigger lies and sometimes smaller lies. And sometimes you can have been married to somebody for a very long time and not know a lot of things about their past. However, when you wake up and you discover that your spouse was a spy or is a spy, that's a pretty shocking, profoundly shocking thing. And I thought, well, let's see what sort of novel I can create out of that.
And that book you discovered, his memoir or autobiography of Wolf, was something that you came upon once you decided to invade Berlin?
Yes, I invaded Berlin through Google and did a whole lot of research. I read a lot about 1949 Berlin, the divided city of Berlin, and I read a lot about the building of the wall. And then you sort of follow a thread. Something interests you, and in the back of the novel or the back of the nonfiction work, you see reference to something, and then you pick that up. And that's how I came to his book, picking up one reference to another reference. And then that suddenly clicked, and I had enough interest in the city and enough interest in the premise that I began to outline a novel. And then, of course, it's always a question of what's the structure of the novel. You sort of have the premise, the story, but then you've got to develop a plot and, all the things that going into a novel, which is how do you reveal things serially and how do you capture people's attention and keep their attention. And that's sort of the tough work of outlining. And
so it is quite an intricate plot with almost countless twists and turns in it. I just want to ask you before we get into it a little more, do you know how widespread the original and real Romeo network was? How many Lotharios or Romeos married unsuspecting women?
It was in place over the course of about 20 years, and I suspect it's in the many dozens. Probably not 100, but certainly more than 25.
Right. So the book, your other ones have women in it, but this book seems to be the central character who we're introduced to at the start, whose husband is missing. And over the course of the book, she goes from someone who practically faints at the start of the book when she discovers her husband is missing to, and I won't reveal anything, a rather startling series of assertive transformations. So was that something that you started with the idea in your head? Was that something evolved, that the character grew as you were writing and developing her character?
Right. I have, before I actually start writing the prose, I do a lot of research and I do an outline, a chapter by chapter outline, which describes what goes on. And I have dossiers on the characters so I know who they are, what their backgrounds are. In her case, I decided at one point to make her a Quaker because it seemed to me that living with the burden of a nonviolent household as a child put her in a particularly conflicted position as you see in the novel, particularly towards the end of the novel. So even though I have an outline, the characters sort of blossom in the writing because you sort of have to give them agency. They sort of, in an odd way, develop their own free will. Not that they're writing, but their characters are defined enough so that the nature of a decision comes out of who they are, who I think they are. And that's sort of the exciting part of writing because I surprise myself with the choices that some of these, characters make. And she is somebody who evolves because she's confronted with choices that she has to make. She's confronted with information she has to deal with. And it's whenever you have decisions you have to make that you sort of reveal who you are. And in her case, she's somebody who has, she's indignant about some of the things that happened to her and indignant about the ways in which she and others in the novel are victims of what I'll call sort of the callous machinations of geopolitical actors. And, in some ways, she's this little woman who finds her anger. And that anger then becomes a way in which she, finds a way to deal with the world that she's been dealt.
So she grew on you and herself.
Yeah, she did, and I'm fortunate to be part of a writers group. We went to we all got MFAs together now. It seems like a lifetime ago, but they are among the very first readers of the novel, and it was many of the comments they made that helped me enrich the story and helped me better complete Anne's character.
Okay.
But I guess one thing I would say is I have not written a novel with a female protagonist before, and I was challenged a bit that I think I would be able to do that, and I didn't spend a whole lot of time wondering whether I would be able to. Because in some measure, all I had to do was look at books that I admired and saw how gender didn't really play between the author and the character. I mean, Heathcliff, who is this remarkable male figure in Wuthering Heights, was written by a 29-year-old woman. And Anna Karenina, which is this remarkable woman, is written by a later middle-aged Russian writer. And so it's I think if you think about character as a collection of instincts and moods and characteristics who then find themselves in the world and are challenged by the world, the choices they make are really human choices. They're not women's choices or male choices. They're character choices. And Anne took on her identity in the novel through the choices that she has to make.
Which must have surprised you. It surprised me by the time I got to the end of this book, if I can use the sort of cliche, the arc of her character, what she had started as and what she ended up as. Were you surprised in the writing, or?
Well, I knew it was going to end something like that, but I wanted to make her a strong character. I see the women in my life, my wife, my mother, they were all strong characters and very nice people, but strong, and they exhibited strength in different ways. And I think that's what I look to find. I find a very strong, memorable character. And in spy novels, you don't. Although more recently, writers have made women central figures in spy novels. That's only been in the last, I don't know, 8 or 10 years. I was thinking this morning that Le Carré, wonderful novelist, brilliant novelist. I don't think any of his main characters are women. In fact, certainly aren't. Women in his novels tended to be secretaries, wives, accessories, or romantic interests. And I think one of the things that's changed in the last 15, 20 years is intelligence services have changed as women have risen in the ranks of the CIA and MI6, that the novels written about those agencies have reflected the reality of the world that we're living in. And so I did feel like it would be appropriate to make Anne the principal character.
Now, my memory of your earlier books is not the clearest it could be. It's somewhat dim, but I feel in my memory that the CIA operatives or the CIA officers are not perfect. They make mistakes, they're confused, they are human. They're not and on someone who doesn't make mistakes. In this book, they seem more bumbling to me. And Anne herself seems to recognize this in an ever more increasing manner. So whether I'm right or not, are these CIA guys less intelligent, less certain about what they're doing, less informed than the characters in the other books? Or am I reading this wrong, which is quite possible?
No, I don't think you're reading it wrong. I mean, agents, covert agents, analysts, paramilitary guys, the administrative types in the CIA, they're all like us. They get out of college, they're looking for something to do. For one reason or another, they choose to go to the CIA. But they have all the same failings, all the same, successes, that anybody has. And, I can just think about our time together in the bureaucracy of Warner Music and Time Warner.
Don't go there.
We can think about
more horrifying in this book. No.
Powerful men and women, and they were all imperfect, and sometimes more imperfect than others. And that's the people in the CIA. So in this book, I do have a senior character who's in Winslow, who's in the CIA, and he has got several agendas here, and you don't discover what those agendas are until you get further in the book. He's a very smart, clever guy. His problem is that his motivations are a little squirrely, and he hides behind some of the things that people say in order to justify what they're doing. I gave him the line, we violate our principles in order to protect them, which is this immensely hypocritical thing to say, but it's the thing people say in order to justify certain types of actions in covert intelligence or in, in the name of national security, any number of terrible things are done. And in this case, there's an element of that. The other character is a CIA agent. Is a little more of the, the comrade, the friend whose role is sort of to facilitate things. He himself isn't a key actor, but he's sort of a friend in arms, and he's conflicted. He's got his own interests, and he wants to protect Anne, but he also has a job to bring her or bring the information she has to the benefit of the agency and West German police.
So, do you understand what draws you to, in novel after novel, to the spy world? Is this something that you see yourself writing exclusively for the balance of your career? What is it that keeps bringing you back to this?
I'm fascinated by the moral grayness that the world that spies live in, and it, in some ways, the spy novel, as I'm writing it, and other people like Joe Cannon and like Carre wrote it, or Graham Greene, deal with human decisions, human emotions, human characteristics, human foibles, and that they happen to place them in the world of spies. And in spies is probably a little bit of a misnomer here, because in the case of Le Carre, his protagonists worked for MI6, but they were really part of a social class. British men who had gone to Eton and Cambridge and Oxford, who found themselves in as a special class of men working in intelligence. But his stories are really, in some ways, love stories, or they're stories about betrayal, stories about suborning friends. And while there is the MacGuffin, which is the spy novel, which is, what is it that you're supposed to accomplish within the first page and the last page? But within it, it's all about these human dynamics. And so I find the spy novel is a convenient set of, training wheels for the things I really want to talk about, which is, human condition, as it's expressed in these somewhat extreme situations. And you can also put people in interesting places like Moscow and Berlin or Beirut or Havana, and that's exciting. So you can add to it this sort of exotic mix of sex and, drama. And that to me makes it entertaining. But I also always go back to the fact that by dealing with human foibles and human characteristics, there's sort of an instructional element to the novel. If you wanted to sit back and say, so what's the zeitgeist that I'm trying to write about? It's about, the good people and bad people, and good people are never all good, and bad people are never all bad. And within that complex...
Well, there were some people at Warner Music who were all bad. Okay.
Well, there's
sorry to interrupt.
Always exceptions. But anyway, so I haven't, I do have another novel that is, pretty much done. And I have ideas for another novel. And I don't like to think of myself, in terms of the end of a career, because I'm still...
Balance. I said balance.
Balance of a career. But I like this form. Some writers in this genre start over with new characters in every novel. Others have a repeating character. And every novel has this repeating character. I sort of is somewhere in between. I like, my first two novels, George Mueller was a very important character. In the third novel, he's sort of a subsidiary character. In the fourth novel, he's important, but he's sort of co-equal with at least two other characters. And in this novel, he has a cameo. And I like that because it allows me to work with us, I'll call it a larger palette of colors, that come out of different characters. So in some ways, I'm trying to synthetically create a larger world through a sequence of novels that deal with, some of the same themes.
You mentioned the locations, and I gave some at the top of this. How do you get such amazing specificity of time and place? I mean, whether or not you've been to Berlin, and I assume you have, there's a detail here, almost as if you grew up there. How do you manage to learn about it and then reproduce it?
Well, as I said, I do a lot of research, and a lot of and it's not, I do look at maps and I do try and figure out what the city looks like. And most importantly, I try and look at the city through the eyes of my characters. There are 9 million New Yorks, 9 million people, 9 million New Yorks. We each have our own New York. And so for me, discovering the Berlin I wanted to write about was to discover the lives of the people I was writing about. So Anne Simpson is an American living there, and she meets an East German who's living in Kreuzberg. And I try to create a sense of what that apartment looks like, what her neighborhood looks like, what she sees when she goes out the door every day and heads towards, their equivalent of our subway. And I also try to include in that the iconic images that we have of Berlin, the Brandenburg Gate, Checkpoint Charlie, but it's all through the eyes of the character. And so if you see if you can build that world, that bubble in which a character lives, you'll see that world through their eyes, and then you add the details that make that a believable place. So I'm not creating a travel log, but I'm trying to bring into the mind of the reader enough details through the eyes of the character to give life to the city. And in some ways, I see the city that I'm describing as its own character. The moods, the weather, the grayness in the case of Berlin, East Berlin, and the opposite, in West Berlin. And there's that one scene where Anne is on her roof with the CIA agent, and they're looking across the wall, and they're seeing the lights and the excitement and the energy of West Berlin at night, and they're seeing this grim, moody, dark city on the other side. And that sort of tale of two cities is one of the things I was trying to evoke.
No, I mean, it doesn't feel like modern Berlin, clearly. It feels like what it is, an historical novel, not from the 17th or 18th century, but, 30 years ago. So do you do that type of research as well, of what the city looked like at that time, or street names, or any details like that? How do you do that?
I spent a lot of time looking at pictures of Berlin from the 63 until 89. And and in fact, I chose to place Anne's apartment in a particular location. And one of the gimmicks, it's not a gimmick, but one of the plot devices in the novel is that you have two apartments on opposite sides of the wall, and somebody can communicate from one to the other by putting things in their window. And because you could talk, there were telephone lines between the two cities, but it was pretty certain that if you were talking on the telephone, somebody in East Germany was listening in. So if you wanted confidential conversations or instructions, you had to figure out a way to communicate. And so I thought 2 windows on opposite sides of the wall would be a really convenient thing. So I had to find the right place for that to happen, because in many places, the walls, they torn down buildings, or they weren't apartment buildings on one side or the other. But there is this one place where it was clear that would work. And so I spent a lot of time mapping out the location of each apartment and looking at pictures through Google Maps or Google Street Views, and then historical pictures. And that was fun, because you don't think about that when you read the book. But on the other hand, it becomes an important element of the book.
Yeah, you're in it.
Yeah.
Now, we spoke about the main character, Anne, the title character, the matchmaker, who's sort of hovering over the entire book because he has set up this sham marriage with one of his underlings. Is he invented based on the Marcus Wolf memoir you read, or is he some combination of other items or characters you came across in your research?
Well, I would say that he was inspired by the Marcus Wolf character. He isn't Marcus Wolf, but Marcus Wolf was known as the man without a face because he tried to hide himself so he wouldn't be recognized. He in his autobiography, quite obviously, makes himself out to be quite a gentleman. And he was very smart, well-read, and my character is a little more sinister, much more sinister, but he's also well-read. And the Marcus Wolf character was sort of fascinating in his own right. He had left. He'd grown up in Berlin, but then his parents were communists, and they escaped Nazism and went to Moscow, where he grew up in a foreign community with Americans and others. And then when the Red Army entered East Berlin, he was among the young men there, and he had been trained to sort of begin the process of building the Stasi, the Secret Service, that would be a mirror image of the KGB. So with many of these East Germans right after World War II, they were believers in the communist system. There was a sort of ideology of equality and opportunity that communism represented in those very early years. Bertolt Brecht was a communist, and he, had those same interests. And it was only over the course of 30 or 40 years that the brittleness, the fragileness, the failure of the communist ideology became clear. And by the end of his career, Marcus Wolf's career, he became disillusioned. He left and tried to establish a life in the newly independent Germany, but he sort of failed at that. And I think one of the interesting things when you look at spy novels is to see what happens to these old Russian, Soviet, East German intelligence spies when their system, their ideology, their system of beliefs is proven to be such a sham and so wrong. How do you deal with that in your life? How do you manage to reconcile, your beliefs as a young man or woman with, where the world turns up? And I think that's they're all quite sad in that respect.
Now, I noticed.
Hello there. Sorry.
Ryan, can I squeeze in one more?
Of course, please. I'm just gonna join.
Okay, thank you. I noticed, I think in all your books, you sprinkle in references to Shakespeare. And we both know that your wife teaches Shakespeare. And I'm wondering two things. One, are these intentional tips of the hat, little gifts that you're giving her by having these references, either in quotations? And in a related way, I was curious, while the epigraph is quoted in the course of the book by basically the one child in the book, there's a Sex Pistols song that a lyric of which, "There's no future, no future, no future for you from God Save the Queen." What brought that into the front of the book?
I'll answer this in the reverse order that you asked them. The music was a big part of East Berlin and West Berlin life. West Berlin happened to be a place where if you were there as a young man, you were not subject to military conscription as you would have been in West Germany. So it was a mecca for many people, and young people at that time were really into music. And it's one of the interesting things about the fall of East Berlin is a lot of it came out of the rebelliousness of the music scene that existed there. And the Sex Pistols were sort of the anthem of the movement. And that's why I chose it. As to Shakespeare, of course it's a nod to Linda. You know, what can I say? She's a brilliant Shakespeare scholar. And but there's another thing that I try to do by inserting Shakespeare is that my characters are, young men and women who have gone to, great schools, and they find themselves in the CIA. But as with everybody, they have interests, and many of my characters have interest in Shakespeare and in English literature. And it's a common thing, among the people I know to sort of randomly quote things. You do it all the time from, a variety of people. And so it's not unusual for somebody to say, "Oh, I'm going to quote Shakespeare in the course of this dialogue," because it's a natural part of their character. So that's how I try and put it in there. The thing that I say about characters is if you want to make a character be smart, have them talk smart. And that's a powerful thing. I want my characters to be smart, to be clever, to be sophisticated, and to make them that way, you make them sound that way.
Good night, sweet prince.
Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with Fred and allow us to host this tonight. I can't stress enough how big of a fans we are of this book, of all your books. We wouldn't be selecting them for the club if we didn't think that they were fantastic. So just as a reminder, there are signed copies of The Matchmaker available at the Mysterious Bookshop. You can order it through our website, or you can call us right now. Also, if you are a subscriber to our Thriller and Espionage Club, these are going out right now. So you should receive it very soon. Paul, thank you again so much. Fred, thank you so much for chatting with Paul tonight and joining us. Please tune in the next time we have Paul. I can promise you almost that we will have him back on here, back with us sometime soon. Have a good night. Order your books. Gentlemen, thank you again so much.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Fred. As always, my pleasure.
The rest is silence.